Folks, thanks for coming along tonight to our discussion on the Liberal Party in the 2022 election. We've got people in the room here. It's great to have some people back at our face-to-face functions and others out on Zoom, and it's great to have our people on Zoom, especially those who live outside of Sydney and in the regions or the states. So we're off tonight. Dave Sharma makes a welcome return to the Institute. He was here in one of our Zoom functions at the time of pandemic, and Hollie Hughes makes a first appearance here. So I'll introduce them very briefly because they're well known. We're going to lead off with Hollie Hughes, the Liberal Senator for New South Wales since 2019 and currently the Shadow Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Energy, followed by Dave Sharma, formerly of the Foreign Affairs Department, former Australian Ambassador to Israel and former member for Wentworth. So we go with Senator Hughes, Mr Sharma, questions and discussion, and because there are a lot of people here and on the call, please make your comments brief. Hollie Hughes. Senator Hughes, thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. It's lovely to be here. It's listening to him tell Anne to sit down. It's almost like family dinner, it's all on the table, hurry up. So it's lovely being with you here tonight. It'd be nice if we were doing the Liberals federal election 2022 Miracle 2.0, but unfortunately we're not doing that. And putting together this speech tonight, I think we may as well title it How to Win Friends and Influence People, because I may not have a lot of them left at the end. So what went wrong? What went right? Where do we need to go to ensure that this Albanese experiment is a one-term wonder? So I wasn't up for election in 2022. I have a bit of a different vantage point as a senator, and my view is obviously a little bit different than those in a House of Representatives seats. However, but before the members who listen tonight who may have lost their seats criticise my contribution or any commentary I might make, I have worked in every federal campaign headquarters and state since 2002, bar one in 2007 when I just had a baby, and it wasn't until I was writing this that I realised the two that I missed were 2007 and 2022 out on the hustings, so we may review what I do each federal election campaign moving forward. But I wanted to sort of just step back a little bit before the election, because I think if we're going to look at what happened, we need to also consider what was happening around the lead up to the election. And I think Barnaby was right when he said this wasn't going to be a COVID election. It really wasn't a COVID election. But unfortunately, the positive narrative that should have existed for the Morrison government just never eventuated. The success that Australia and Australians saw weathering the pandemic, economically, the jobs that were kept, there was no credit at all given for that. In fact, Scott was consistently criticised, whether that's our culture, a glass half full mentality. There was never any acknowledgement or celebration of what we did do right, but there was sort of constant criticism. And look, Scott's language wasn't perfect. Things like "it's not a race" obviously resonated strongly right through to election day. But there was little consideration. At the time the comment was made, we were looking at other countries around the world who were facing much higher mortality rates. There was issues with the rollout in Europe. And were we weathering the storm really, really well at the time? Yes, we were. So the context was lost, but there was this daily prosecution of Scott's language. JobKeeper, of course, was perhaps the most critical government intervention that we saw through the pandemic. And it was certainly one of the things that when I was out on the hustings during the campaign, small business owners and their employees were saying to us, without that, we would never have survived. We would not still have our job. And there was a lot of appreciation for that package. But again, very little positive was ever said about it. There was a lot focused on what the ALP said, that when we ended it, we were going to fall off an economic cliff. We didn't. We then had the lowest unemployment rates we had than even before the pandemic. And when Labor proposed $6 billion in additional spending, paying $300 to people who'd already had the vaccination, that was just giving us a bit of an insight as to what the Labor Party might have done in managing this pandemic. And we know that it would have had much greater budget impacts. But I know that we're here for the Liberal Party tonight, so I did just want to set some scene of what was happening in the lead up to it, and the fact that we were very much behind the eight ball and Scott very much under attack consistently. So what went wrong, and what will no doubt be clung to and reported on? What's the dirty laundry that most people won't want to talk about, but is probably what we need to put front and centre as soon as possible so that we can acknowledge it. And, there will be relationships that are fractured. Some of them will continue to fracture, but those sort of things need to be rebuilt. But for those of you that don't know me, I come from the Bill Heffernan School. My first political job was with Hefo. We call a spade a shovel. We have fierce debate and critique. It's never personal. And once we're done, we expect to move on and fix it and all work together. So, again, I'm going to start with New South Wales Division. And a few years ago, it introduced a thing called the Warringah motion, something that purported to be about democracy. But shock of all shocks, it was fundamentally about political gain. There was jockeying about who was going to support what part of it. I'm happy to claim that after a couple of decades in the party and seeing plenty of politically motivated activities shrouded in goodness, that this was rubbish and I was never a convert. And there's been two big issues that we've seen come about that. The first one is the branch stack and the conference stack. These, it's always about the numbers. I get the numbers. I've used the numbers a bit myself in my time in politics. But these weren't party members that were actively engaged. And when we were reaching out to them, and these people hold state council delegate voting positions within branches and conferences, were applying to us, I don't even vote Liberal, why would I help you? So I think it was pretty clear that these people were not genuine members of the party. So I think that there's some activity there that was going on under the guise of these reforms that was going to create problems for us as we went into the campaign. But I think the other problem that the New South Wales Division faced in particular was the expansion of the New South Wales State Executive to 29 members, of which 90% was required to get motions through. Now, for anyone who has experience on boards or understands corporate governance, there is no way you can manage a board of 29 people, and there is no way you can get 90% agreement to push things through. So there was a block on that body that when they didn't say what they liked, they could block it in the room, and if they couldn't do that, they would take the division off to court. And when I was on executive for 14 years, the going to court started later in my term. I'm of the view you take the division to court and you lose, see you later. You've brought the party into disrepute, you've cost political capital, you've lost campaign time, and a lot of it is done for self-serving reasons. And there's also some of the reasons, things like pre-selections weren't able to occur, that there wasn't as much campaign preparation, I think, as we would have liked to have seen, and that there wasn't as much engagement with the party membership itself to start organising things like the very nuts and bolts that are involved in campaigning. So, and I am trying to go through this because I've been very much told by Gerard I have 15 minutes on the dot. So, yeah. But we do actually need to have a look at these reforms and what their impact was on the division and our ability to get campaign ready, because I think there were real impacts there. So do we roll back those reforms? Do we have a look at where we are now? But I certainly don't think we start tacking things on like a Christmas tree and new forms of reforms. And I have been bemused. One of my colleagues is out there with a new Sydney motion, which looks at a particular part of the process, the nomination review process. And I understand that Senator Bragg has been through the NRC process when he contested Wentworth and the Senate pre-selections. I don't think it's the key part of why we didn't get to our candidates when we should have. We had candidates wanting to run, not wanting to run. We couldn't get people to nominate in certain seats. People were pulling out. But I do think that we need to ensure that we don't just look at it, as I said, like a Christmas tree and start hanging on next motion, next reform. Let's have a look at this. It's too important coming into 2025 that we get all of those things right. So, and when we talk about some of the democratic processes, and you will hear people call, well, there was no democratic process, these candidates were appointed. No one's made a comment about the upper house member in New South Wales Parliament who was completely appointed without any oversight. I don't think the Liberal Party even knew it was happening for the replacement for Don Harwin, as well as the appointment of candidates to run in state by-elections that were again bypassed anything within the party. So if it's good for one, it's good for everyone, and if you don't like it, then you don't like it everywhere. So it's that consistency that I think we need to see. And one of the other problems that we had with this state executive was they actually abandoned local government in a number of our key areas. They actually dissolved conferences where we had held mayoralties, where we had held the balance of power in councils, and that did have an impact. If you go into the hills in some of these regions, Parramatta, we had held those councils and all of a sudden we weren't running Liberal-based tickets, or we had shafted all the sitting councillors to put in a whole new, properly factionally aligned, according to some people. We lost those councils, and that did limit us with our on-the-ground contact, because local government is obviously the closest level of government to people. If we did have more time, I really would have liked to have had a look at some stage about senators' roles. Senators, we play a role with duty seats. Some of us spent a lot of time in our duty seats. Some other senators didn't. Some of us had areas that we built on and grew and made sure that they're there for the future. I still hold out great hopes for the Hunter, Shortland in particular. We have an absolute rock star, and the margin is now down to it being a marginal seat. And if anyone had thought Shortland would have ever been in play for us in the past, it's extraordinary to see the movement around that Lake Macquarie Hunter region. But we do need to see, where the senators' roles, what impact they had, and who was effective at building up new areas, and perhaps where seats may have been lost under other people's tutelage. So I think that is an important part. But coming to the campaign proper, I'm going to start by apologising to Dave, because I'm pretty sure some of this stuff he's just going to love. But on the matter of modern Liberals, the no Liberal branding, different colours, the abandonment of core Liberal Party members, in my view, if modern Liberals wanted to be so independent, they should have run as one. And by claiming to be a modern Liberal, every other colleague by inference was old-fashioned, outdated, or a dinosaur. All of these candidates and members were pre-selected by party members. They had previously been represented by very proud Liberals, whom all maintained the logo on their campaign materials. And I know this will upset some people who I do call friends, but as I said on election night, you got to dance with the one that brung you. You have to have a point of difference, and when you move away from being Liberal to some form of Liberal light, a light blue, or whatever, you're really just a teal without the cult following. So, before we get to the teals and the cultish nature around them, there is the fact that they're not independents at all. They knocked off some fantastic Liberals, and now with an Albanese majority government in the House, they are completely and utterly irrelevant. But as I mentioned previously, this wasn't a COVID election. It wasn't really an election about our national security, the economy, border protection, and really it wasn't even an election about energy and how that works in reality. It was an election fought on what I'm going to call luxury issues. Again, how to win friends and influence people. I feel I may need to pause here to allow those from the ABC watching to have their heads explode and their Twitters logged in. When I say luxury issues, when people are secure in their jobs, when paying the mortgage isn't a problem, when the kids are happy at school and everything's ticking along, they have time to think about other things. We used to call them the doctor's wives, and this is what I've now started to referring as luxury issues. Now, and again, I can see former Senator Chris Public here, he and I have had this discussion. I am going to say that the trans issue was one of these. And whilst I'm sure my TERF membership card is currently being boosted to platinum, I am prepared to go out on a limb and suggest that if you lose your job and can't pay your mortgage, that they are likely to become more important top-of-mind issues for you. So the focus that the trans issue got during the election was disproportionate in many, many ways. But again, where did it start? The Religious Discrimination Bill, a legacy of Malcolm Turnbull. In exchange for the same-sex marriage plebiscite, we got a commitment to the Religious Discrimination Bill. So many people are happy to forget that. Now, before anyone speculates any other way, I completely support same-sex marriage, always have. I thought the Religious Discrimination Bill was unnecessary. It was a political promise, and it was a bill that Michaelia Cash, in all honesty, turned into something that wasn't perfect, but was 100 times better than what she'd originally inherited. And we all know that disunity is death in politics. And this bill really did put to the centre a lot of disunity. And it did where I don't think it really needed to exist. It was managed badly overall, and I'm happy for Dave to correct me, but from what we were told in the Senate was that the vote over that matter was fuelled by duplicity, out-and-out lies to the PM's face about who was voting for what. Now, I'm getting the hurry up and we're never going to get there. So I am just going to say that the trans issue did become bigger than it should have been. It wasn't helped by the New South Wales Treasurer, Matt Cain. We didn't even know when he came out on Sky after the election saying there were too many fringe issues in the election, and we didn't get substantial public policy debate. I wonder why that was. And we didn't even know at that stage that he was trying to throw his colleagues Nat Ward under a bus at a press conference. So those things were obviously not helpful. Now, the other issue that, as you can imagine, I was incredibly popular with was when I went on ABC News Breakfast the morning after being appointed the Shadow Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Energy to say that climate change was a luxury issue as well. And again, this is about people when they can't afford to pay their mortgage aren't prepared to pay more for climate change. Now, I'm very much in favour of renewables. I think they're great. If we could all have renewables and we could have them connected to the grid, that would be fantastic. But we can't. Technology just does not exist. Coal and gas are going to be part of the mix for a very long time to come. And one of the things that I do think when we look at the energy market, it's very complex. Most people really have very little understanding of how you get energy, how you turn the light on and how it works. So most renewable energy is not connected to the grid at all. So it might work with your solar panels, but there's no storage. That would require an entire rewiring of the grid, which is one of the biggest man-made things in the world. Dispatchable energy does not equal supply. People didn't understand that last week. It wasn't that there wasn't dispatchable energy. It was just that the market cap had gone from 15,000 a megawatt hour to 300 per megawatt hour, which made it impossible for the companies to operate. So the NEG is really only on the east coast, despite it being a national energy grid. Victorian government's got a moratorium on gas. New South Wales government has stood in the way of the Santos Narrabri project that's so years behind where it should have been. And we're seeing state governments filled with ideological zealots who will not work with coal generators to help them transition out of the market sensibly. So we can't let the Teals off the hook, but we didn't hold them to account. We didn't ask them questions. We didn't ask them what businesses they wanted to shut down. We didn't ask them who couldn't afford electric vehicles, why should they cover the costs of all the road excise. We didn't ask them how much they thought every Australian should pay. We didn't hold them to account, and we didn't offer a point of difference. And I think that's where we lost out to the Teals, and we do need to take it up to them and keep it up to them. Simon Holmes Quarter's been out on the capacity mechanism, haven't heard from any one of his acolytes, so they obviously don't have much to say anymore. I will finish quickly. The two things I think we got wrong from a Liberal Party perspective, I don't think we read messaging anymore like we used to in market research. It's a point in time when you do these, you do your focus groups and you meet with people, it's at one point in time. And it's what they're thinking then. It's not where they're going to move to, and it's not where they need to be led to and encouraged and informed. So we didn't do a very good job with reading our focus groups and our messaging. I think we've also fallen back on this. We don't talk about things that we don't win in that space. We don't talk about childcare, the NDIS. We don't like to talk about climate change because we don't win in that space. Those days are finished with social media and everything out. We need to talk about everything. We cannot vacate the space in areas because we think we don't win on it. We do, we have to be able to talk about them and talk about them in terms that our voters resonate with, which is usually generally about economic security and how working those issues through benefits all of us as Australians. So I hope I stayed under my 15 minutes. I did as much as I could, and I promise I will send through a longer one.
Well, many thanks to Hollie Hughes. The full paper will be published completely when Anne puts together the Sydney papers online. Dave Sharma, thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. Thank you. Thanks, good evening. Thank you, Gerard, for the introduction. It's a little sobering to be introduced as former this and former that, and I hope there's a future somewhere in my biography that emerges at some point.
Absolutely.
Senator Hughes, lovely to be here with you tonight, my former colleague and someone I have a high respect for and work very closely with as well. Look, I think it's important to focus tonight partly on the rebuilding task ahead, but I think in order to do that properly and to do it justice, we need to understand the extent of our loss as a government and as a coalition, and of how we lost as well. John Howard, I think it was, famously had the saying that the voters always get it right, and it's important that we listen to what they are telling us from this election, and we don't discount or dismiss it. This is the most extensive election loss for the coalition in the post-war era, and it's the worst election loss for the Liberal Party since 1983, by my own reckoning. After earlier losses for us in 1972, in 1983 and in 2007, the coalition still held at least 40% of the seats in the House of Representatives. Today we hold 58 out of 151 seats, or less than 40%, 38% to be precise. So this is the worst election loss we've been through as a government, as a coalition in the post-war era. How do we lose? Well, bluntly speaking, and in my view, we lost it in New South Wales and in Victoria. New South Wales and Victoria still account for well over half the seats in the federal parliament. And this was true in 1996, and it remains true today. Despite their vaunted place in our political coverage, Queensland and Western Australia account for a little less than 1/3 of all seats. And this was true in 1996 and it remains true today. New South Wales and Victoria today, 86 out of 151 seats, or about 57% of seats. Queensland and WA, 45 out of 151, or 30% of seats. So you cannot win federal elections in Queensland and Western Australia alone. And since 1996, every election we have won has involved us winning roughly half or more of all the seats on offer in New South Wales and Victoria. In 1996, in 1998, in 2001 and 2004, we won at least 52% of the New South Wales and Victorian seats. In 2007, when we lost to Labor, we won only 42% of those seats. And in 2013, when we regained government, we were back to 54% of New South Wales and Victorian seats. So to me, I think this is the obvious pathway forward. And today, 2022, this Parliament, we hold only 20, as a coalition, we hold only 27 of New South Wales and Victoria's 86 seats, or 31%. So we've got a pretty big task to rebuild in those two states. So in my view, there is simply no way we can win back government without winning back a big chunk of these seats. We need to claw back something in the order of 16 seats in these two states alone, in New South Wales and Victoria, to have a pathway back. And we cannot allow New South Wales and Victoria to become red states where we've ridden off this territory and we're resigned to them being Labor stronghold into the future. There is no pathway back to government for us as a coalition if that's the case. Linked to this is the observation, and it is only an observation, not a judgment, that the Nationals did not lose a single seat, and the Nationals aligned LNP members up in Queensland did not lose a single seat. Of the 19 seats that we lost, all of them were Liberal seats. So the task for rebuilding here is primarily one for us as a Liberal Party, and the primary focus of this rebuilding has to be in New South Wales and Victoria. We can't hope to regain government without substantially rebuilding our stocks there. And we can't hope to win government again either without winning back some of these teal seats. On my count, we have at least 11 seats which were traditionally Liberal that are now being held by independents or by Greens. 11 seats. Mayo, Indi, Warringah, Wentworth, North Sydney, Mackellar, Goldstein, Kooyong, Curtin, Brisbane and Ryan. That's a big chunk of real estate. Unless we win back a substantial number of these, there is also no pathway back to government. That's the scale and the extent of our loss, and I think it's important that we're frank about that. This wasn't just a one-off election loss, this was a pretty historic election loss. Unless we come to terms with the magnitude of that, we're not going to be good at coming up with the right prescriptions. I think there are some obvious pitfalls ahead as we go ahead in this exercise, and these are pitfalls that political parties often succumb to after losses of this sort. The first pitfall is to fail to heed the message that the voters have sent and instead offer them a reheated and repackaged version of more of the same. This was the trap that the Conservatives fell into after their historic loss to Tony Blair's Labor in Britain in 1997, and it took them 4 opposition leaders and 8 years before they digested that message of the voters and began to modernise their party and their offering. We've got a rebuild to do, and opposition is the time to do it, not only to refresh our policies, but also to refresh our party structures, our membership, our candidate recruitment processes, and our campaigning. The second pitfall would be to ride off large swathes of Australia and to pursue a sort of niche electoral strategy. Whether you like it or not, we are not going to win government again without doing a lot better in New South Wales and Victoria. This isn't the United States. Our demography, our political traditions, and our compulsory voting system mean that you cannot win elections simply by appealing to and energising your base. I think learning those lessons has been made harder by the fact, for us as a party, that the territory and the seats that we need to win back now are so lacking in a voice in our party room. The third pitfall would be to fail to differentiate ourselves properly from the National Party as a Liberal Party. Yes, we govern in coalition, but we are separate parties with separate histories, ideologies, values and constituents, and we should be able to reflect this, especially when in opposition. Now, I do believe that there is a way ahead for us as a Liberal Party and a pathway back to government that is true to our values and our principles and our founding ethos. And I see three elements to this. Firstly, re-energising our reformist credentials. To my mind, at the last election, we gave voters many reasons not to vote for Labor, but we didn't give them many reasons to vote for us. Yeah. And I think that was a failing. We need serious reform offerings in tax, in energy, in productivity, in the digital economy, in workforce participation, in immigration, in superannuation, in education. And yes, these things are hard, and yes, there are always many vested interests who fight to the death to protect the status quo. But we need to find a way to have these debates and make these offerings to the public. Secondly, protecting and preserving our environment is a naturally conservative value, and it should be in Australia. It was Nixon who created the great national parks in the United States. It was Margaret Thatcher who first called out the risks of global warming and climate change. We shouldn't be afraid to champion these causes here either as a centre-right party, but we should also not be afraid to offer a more market-friendly and technology-oriented way of doing so, but we cannot vacate this space. And lastly, we need to be offering policies which reflect, to my mind, some of the modern pressures and realities of family life today. We need to be finding ways to make it easier for women to return to work, for making the education system serve students and parents, not teachers, for busting up some of the cosy oligopolies that take advantage of Australian citizens and Australian households, by making it easier to start a business, by making it easier to earn money, by helping to get red tape and endless administrative clutter out of the lives of everyday Australians. These are Liberal values, but we need to make sure that they are aligned to the modern era and the modern everyday experience of Australians. Now, political parties do always need to regenerate, and election losses are often, unfortunately, the vehicle for doing so. But in order to do this properly, I think it's important that we do the necessary reflection and regeneration, that we understand and do not understate the magnitude of our loss here, and that we be quite clinical and ruthless in our analysis and prescriptions. That's the only way back to government for us. Thank you, Gerard. I've stayed under time, I believe.
Thank you, Gerard. Well, Dave's slightly under and Hollie's slightly over. All balances out.
Together.
It all turns out very well, but everyone here has got to do the right thing and keep their own comments and questions limited as well in time. So if you both come back here, I'll stand over here. One of you stand on one side, the other on the other, and we'll. So just very quickly, starting off, you're not in the Parliament anymore, Dave. You are, Hollie. What would be the first policy you'd go with in the Parliament if you were there, David? And what would be the one you think the or the Liberal Party or the Coalition should be going with as part of the renewal process? Dave?
Look, I would. I think we need a tax reform agenda. I think it should be in concert with some of the work that the states are doing, particularly around stamp duty and land tax. I think we need to lessen the reliance upon income tax as a source of revenue for the federal government. And we need to focus more on growth taxes, and we need to remove inefficient taxes. I think these are things that are hard to do when you're in government, but I think opposition gives you some of the blank space and the clear air to do that.
Well, I think when we get back to Parliament, and unfortunately we've only got 40 days of Parliament between now and the end of the year, so much for that transparency. But as we've all seen over the last couple of weeks, certainly the energy crisis, the energy issue has become incredibly prevalent. And I think when we get back to Parliament, we're going to have to be prepared to have some discussions around that issue. The Senate means that the Labor Party can either work with us or they can work with the Greens. So that will give us an indication of, I think, where the country is going to be headed in how they decide to put forward their policies. And we're obviously still discussing where we are with ours. But certainly energy and energy security is going to be something that's very much top of mind when we get back to Parliament.
And?
I think the
just
biggest challenge for the Liberal Party is winning the Teals. I come from North Sydney. It didn't, I didn't miss the fact that they were a lot of women who knocked off a lot of men. And I have been banging my head for a long time against brick walls about the fact that the Liberal Party is ignoring the fact that it is not inviting or attracting intelligent women who are like the women in the Teals. Now, they may be very much from a different policy background or the left wing or whatever, but they were articulate mostly and able to carry the day. So how do you think the Liberal Party can right that wrong? Because I really do think that the Liberal Party is missing out on talent from females.
Well, let's start with Hollie, go to Dave.
And you and I have been to a number of functions over 20 years where this has been an issue. I think the way we do our pre-selection processes is actually an inhibitor for women. I have 900 pre-selectors, and if I hadn't had a now ex-husband, but the husband at the time, who was very supportive though of me being involved in politics, I wouldn't have had the scope to be on the state executive for 14 years, to be active in the party and actively work towards gaining pre-selection, which I did a couple of times, and thanks to the double dissolution, etc., I had my entry delayed for a few years. But we do make it difficult for women. We have a women's council that meets at 11:15 on a Wednesday. Corporate women aren't going to that. You know, we haven't moved with the times, and we certainly, if you've got to win a plebiscite pre-selection and you've also got young children and you've got a career, going to every cocktail party and, you know, rubber chicken dinner that goes on so that you can meet people, it is more difficult, and that is the reality for women. And so I think unless we do start to review some of the ways that we introduce women, that we do conduct ourselves, that we do look at what opportunities exist. But it would be good also as well that some of the blokes in the Liberal Party didn't go out of their way to knock women off. And we see that in pre-selections quite often, that women are put in marginal seats, women are challenged, and women are denigrated and pulled down when they do make it into Parliament. So I think we can do a lot better within the party structure itself to get women there in the first place, put them in safer seats, make that entry a little bit easier. But then when they're there, try and keep them there.
Dave, you want to make a comment?
Look, just quickly, David Cameron was here last week out visiting, and I'm sure many people spoke to him at the time, but one of the things I'd asked him was, well, you know, what did you do in 2005 when you became the opposition leader, and how did you broaden the appeal of the Conservative Party? And they went through a very conscious and methodical and resource-intensive exercise. Yes, to get more women, also to get more minorities into Parliament, also to get people from different professional backgrounds. But it was quite a centralised operation. And, you know, I'm not a political animal. I'm quite new to politics. I haven't been involved in the party and the machinery. But what struck me as a new MP was just how loose the arrangements are here and how much a sort of a decentralised franchisee operation we run, without a kind of beating heart at the centre of the operation saying, we need to be doing this, we need to be encouraging this, we need to be doing that. Sort of all left to the best intentions and goodwills of the members at large, which often doesn't deliver the results you need.
Before we go to the next question, just briefly, there are quite a few men who call for more women in the party, but they keep their own seats. So not always,
and usually encourage other men to run against women.
Sacrifice.
Hypocrisy is alive and well.
Yeah, there's one right at the moment. So what happens there? I mean, no one ever sort of says, well, you've got a pretty safe seat, why don't you hand it over?
Look, I think it has been said, I just don't think the advice has been taken up. I mean, what is a safe seat now? I think you would have looked at Dave's, but certainly you would have looked at Celia Hammond in Curtin and thought, we've got a woman in a safe seat, and look where we've ended there. So I think the days of the safe seat might be gone with the wind. I hope not, but you just never know. Coming back to Dave's point, it's interesting. The way the Conservative Party does it is they actually have a candidate pool, and people go through a process to become basically an approved candidate of the party, and then they go out and they meet with local areas. So you've kind of got a pool of candidates, and they're approved and they've gone through the vetting process, and they go out and present to different parties and parts of the party. So, and it's, you know, I was born in Adelaide, lived in Perth, moved to Sydney, went to Bathurst at uni, came back, got married, moved to Orange, then Moree. I can never stand in front of a house and go, I was raised here, I'm raising my children round the corner, and I went to this school. And I mean, personally, do a TAFE course. It's not the biggest selling point of someone. But if we're going to start looking at, the only thing that we're going to look at is your postcode and that your deep connection somewhere. If you're a good political operator, if you're a good representative, if you're a good leader, and you've got an intellect and a skill and a contribution to make, the postcode shouldn't be the limiting factor for you. And so perhaps looking at some sort of pool, that there's approved candidates, they go around, and we actually say, these are the people we want to see in Parliament, now let's find out where we're going to put them, rather than sort of the whim of, as Dave says, each sort of very loose franchise conference.
Okay, so down the back there. Don't stand in front of the camera. Okay. Speak into the microphone.
Is it connected now?
Yep.
Okay. There's one thing that, to me, that stood out about the election. The Nationals didn't lose a single seat, they gained one. The Liberals lost massively. Now, I think probably the reason for that is because everybody knew that the Nationals actually stood for something. They stood for definite principles. The Liberal Party was all over the place. They would do whatever. Now, in particular...
Okay, you've got to be quick.
Okay. Do you think that the party failed to talk about the impossibility, the technical impossibility of the energy storage and other things associated with climate? It was proposed by the Greens and by the Liberal, by the Labour, and also...
okay, so the question is...
I'm going to let Dave take most of this because he talked about the NATs.
We've got to move on. The question is, was an error made in not talking about the impossibility of the Greens and those in the Labor Party meeting the targets that were announced for emissions reduction? Dave?
Yeah. But we did have a good technology, not taxes platform. We had 7 reforms there. But I think it was one of the areas we said we don't want to talk about it because we lose ground on that issue, and we didn't prosecute our case effectively. But Dave, you made that point with the NATs.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I don't think we were differentiated enough from the Nationals, and a lot of the campaign directed against me was you vote with Barnaby Joyce. I mean, we're not even in the same party, and that was because our brand wasn't sufficiently different. Should we have run a campaign like that? I think the political reality is it wouldn't have worked, bluntly speaking. This issue, there's a messianic element to this issue, like it or not, that's the political reality of it, and people are looking at a litmus test of whether you get it or not. It's as simple as that. People aren't interested in the technical details. That's the political truth.
So there's a question here, then we go there, yes?
Despite my youthful looks, I'm a self-funded retiree, and I can assure you when I'm at my club, at East Leagues Club, the last thing we are talking about is climate change, because most of us can see through this ballyhoo. We're not against getting rid of bad environment and stuff like that, but all you ever heard was this environment all the time, so it's inevitable and all this sort of thing. And frankly, we were sick of it. I mean, we're more interested in the bread and butter issues, like most of the people I think in this country.
And that's why when I talked about luxury issues, every time we talked about one of these other issues that wasn't the economy, that wasn't national security, that wasn't border protection, it wasn't any of those issues, every column inch, every debate minute, every grab on TV that was on another issue other than those factors. Self-funded retirees, they used to be our bread and butter. We worked so closely with self-funded retirees. Interest rates. Did anyone say when interest rates went up that was good for you guys? And there's a complete ignoring of that, the impact that interest rates, it's not great for some, but it's good for others. We need to have a better understanding of that economic impact.
Dave, have you got any feedback from any clubs?
Look, I mean, I don't doubt that's the case, Leon, but I'd say to go to Hollie's point, where we got distracted on the campaign or where we got off message, I mean, when I think of what were the 2 biggest distractions, it was Matt Canavan saying net zero is dead, which derailed us undoubtedly because that's all we had to talk about for 4 or 5 days, and Catherine Deves and Warringah, because then everyone was speaking about that. Now, I think you could argue both of those were self-inflicted.
There's a question here, just...
And egged on by one of our own, very kindly.
Hi, thank you for your...
Don't stand,
Okay. Thank you for the discussion tonight, but I feel that one particularly important part that is missing in both Liberal and Labor, and the reasons why the Teals and the Greens got so many votes that everyone was floored, is the youth vote, the 18 to 35s. They are not interested at the moment in either of the major parties because they don't think that either of them represent them. And if you want to say it's like an anti-vote, that they voted maybe the Teals, and I believe certainly the difference of the normal people who vote Greens and the increased part of their vote.
Okay.
So my question basically is, how are you going to address that
Yeah.
situation? Because I think
Got it.
without them,
Okay, we've got it. Youth vote.
So
Okay.
I think one of the issues, and again, Dave's out on the ground as a lower house member, but we've got an education system that's basically run by Marxists.
Yes.
And so when kids are at school and they're being taught all this absolute left-wing rubbish, that's where they're leaving school and that's where they're landing. So when you've got a problem in your education system, it's going to take your generation to fix it. Maybe their parents need to turn the internet off for, to 1 hour a day, that stop them allowing them to use the car, and they get public transport.
Don't denigrate young people that way. That's
Okay, Chris.
Well,
Chris, we don't have interjections. You can ask a question. Finish. No,
well,
Hollie.
I've got 3 kids, and they just don't have any comprehension of the impact of what they want to talk about, and the understanding of, how to pay a mortgage, how you have to get a job, how you have to work, those sorts of things. I think elude not everyone, but there is a generational issue.
Dave, you want to make a comment?
I'd just say, I think there's something sort of more structural to this, which is basically that the two-party system is under strain in Australia more broadly. And I think, in most areas of life, people are used to highly differentiated choices on consumer goods, on telco providers, on airlines, on anything you do. There's sort of the nature of the market these days is highly segmented, right? Political parties have managed to buck that trend, but increasingly I think you see people who, they don't want to identify 60 or 70% with a political brand, they want to identify 90 to 100% with a brand, and the way you do that is you create a brand just for that segment, which is a teal or an independent or a green. That's hard for both major parties to combat. I don't know if the future means, a continued diminishing primary vote for both major parties in Australia. It may well be.
So we've got a question from Zoom here. The suggestion is that the achievements of the previous government were not mentioned sufficiently aside from what happened with COVID, and why the suggestion is that more emphasis should have been placed on why you should vote for the coalition. So you did cover some of these.
Yeah, take that as a statement. I think we're in a unity ticket on agreement with that.
Although I don't think we could have spoken about it much more. I think the problem was the electorate wanted to hear more from us about not what we'd done, but what we were going to do.
All right, so there's a question here. Yeah, we'll come to you in a minute. Yeah, got to be brief, okay?
Okay.
Is that on? Question for Hollie. You touched on this, but it seemed to me that the sort of dysfunctional performance of the New South Wales branch and and Alex Hawke federally interfering in candidate selections or blocking candidate selections, more to the point, did a lot to leave the Liberals losing seats that they could have won in New South Wales.
That's
Dave's point. And I was campaigning out in Warringah,
We've got to be brief.
and we were too late on the ground. It was impossible. It was hopeless.
Yeah, and look, there's certainly the narrative that somehow or other it's all Alex Hawke's fault. And for those of us that have been around for a while, everything does tend to be Alex's fault at some point in time. That's usually not the case when you drill down into it, but that does tend to be the overriding narrative. We did have, we had candidates nominate for Warringah, and then every single one of them pulled out. So we ended up in a situation where we didn't have a candidate that we could put through the process because they weren't there. And they'd all pulled out, I think, by the November. But I agree. But we can't do pre-selections when we don't have a candidate or we're constantly in court and we can't run the process. We also had Susan Lee stacked out by a state executive member who was prepared to, you want to talk about knock off a good woman, a young man went and stacked out conferences to knock her off. So, there were things that were being done to ensure that, Susan Lee, Trent Zimmerman, that those sort of pre-selections as well weren't being jeopardised.
Okay. So
It's Gerard, I'm very conscious we've got to move on.
No, we're fine. We've got plenty of time. Everyone keeps it brief. There's a question here and then there. Okay, you two, work it out. Okay, there's one here. Okay, we've got to be brief. Talking to the microphone.
In this election, has there been so often people from the party speaking against their own party in the government? Someone from your house, Matt Keane, it's been quite incredible.
The question is, are there too many people speaking against their own party?
Yeah.
In the Liberal Party?
Absolutely. And it's not helpful. And, everyone in their families likes to keep things in-house. I think if you've really got some issues, maybe you can have those conversations in-house. It wasn't helpful. and it'll be interesting to see what happens coming into some other elections going forward.
Okay, so we've got time for both. Okay, come on.
John.
Speaking in the microphone.
Push it up.
John Howard always referred to the Liberal Party's successes as partly being due to the fact that it was a broad church.
Yeah.
What are the chances going forward now of it continuing to or remaining a broad church, given so many moderates lost their seats as a result of what happened in basically Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane?
So we start with Dave.
Look, I mean, we have to do it. We have to reassemble a broad church. It's the only pathway back to government. It is made hard by the fact, though, that one half of the church has been hollowed out, and it just means that the remaining half needs to be, I think, good-willed and constructive in making sure that they help rebuild that part of the church. Yeah.
Hollie?
That nave.
We can have a broad church, but you don't need to go the whole full width of the circle of the political spectrum. It is centre-right, and it should stay on that centre-right side of the political spectrum. If you're not centre-right, you're not in the Liberal Party.
Okay.
Thank you.
Speak into the microphone, please. No interjections. Okay. Yes.
Thank you for you. Am I go now? Okay. It's been a lot of technical stuff and detail tonight. To my way of thinking, right from the word go, you need not just a leader, but for the leadership right down through the parliamentary party, people with the personality and the rhetoric and the oratory to attract the younger voters.
Okay.
But when I say attract younger voters, I may mean attract them to something they might like, something that galvanises them to get interested. Keep to Liberal policies, but you've got to find a way of getting through to the young cohort.
Yep.
Yeah. And look, Dave and I are a similar generation. We've got, kids that are at school and all those sorts of things. And it's always the same people that get involved in the local community events or the local committees or involved in clubs or get involved in things. And as you go down the generations now, it's less and less people that are getting involved in those sort of community activities, and that includes political parties. So it's going to require a shift. It's going to require a shift in thinking, but we do need to do better at social media. The Greens were so successful because their social media campaigns were unbelievable this election, and no one knew they were happening except the people they were targeting, which was none of us.
Dave, do you want to make a comment?
I think your point's right, and it's partly the challenge is for us to be addressing issues that do occupy people's lives, but especially young people and people in the prime of their professional lives or the prime of their child raising and family, starting a family life. And I don't think we spoke or addressed about a lot of those pressures, which loom large in people's everyday existence, but don't often feature in our political discourse. There's any number of issues you could talk about, like the skills necessary to find a job in the new industries and the new economy of the future, helping, making sure that the burden is shared at home for the reality that these days most households have both parents working and both parents having professional ambitions. All these sorts of issues, I don't think we did a good enough job in creating and selling policies in those areas.
Michael?
Thanks, Gerard. Might just put it to Hollie and Dave that unless the Liberal Party reforms itself, all of the reforms that all of the worthy reforms that we're talking about here tonight will come to nothing. And this cannot be a renovation job. This needs to be the full knockdown, drag out, rebuild job. Let me ask you. I think people say, so what's the model? Well, amazingly, the model that we can look at that exists today is an organisation called Get Up. There is another organisation called Climate 200, and as painful as it may be, we have got to learn the lessons of these community-based organisations and get with the program. What do you think?
It's like the Hotondo home rebuild required at the moment, that we do knock it down, we rebuild, and we have a look at everything that we're doing, because, as I said, it can't be the Christmas tree that we just keep popping decorations on as we look at different types of reform. We need to look at how we do everything, whether it's community engagement, whether it's how we keep people involved, how we attract members. Like, do people want to be a member and go to a branch meeting, but perhaps they might want to be aligned? We tried policy branches, maybe to bring those a bit more in. It's a whole lot of things that we need to have a look at that do make us more relevant, more community-based, but also respectful of people's time. because people have very, very little time and they want to do things in their own time. And I'm not quite sure our current model of branch membership and attending and doing all of these things, we make it quite onerous if you're on the executive of a branch or a conference. And that's just another job for people to do, and people sort of have enough to do. So I do think you're right, though. If we're going to do this, it needs to be done properly, and it can't be a Christmas tree hanging on another decoration. It's got to be a full rebuild.
Dave?
Look, I'd agree. I think it needs to be quite dramatic, but I wouldn't underestimate the scale of that challenge, because every organisation has a vested interest in its continuation, and the office bearers have a vested interest in their continued hold of the office and everything else, and that's going to be difficult. I mean, and that's partly why I stressed the magnitude of our loss, because it's important that people realise we can't just tinker around here. The car doesn't just need a tune-up, it needs a bit more than that.
And I think it's also fair to say that the Labor Party recognises they've got a significant problem here too with their younger voters. It's not simply a Liberal Party.
And do we have a problem with preferential voting and all those sorts of things as we go forward? Because if we look at primary vote versus the Teals are getting in on 25% primary vote, so they're not actually representing the majority of their seats at all either.
So, Ms. Spender won on your preferences, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there was other than I think Zali and Warringah might have won on primary, but or been first on primary. But if we had a first past the post voting system in Australia, or even an optional preferential like they do in New South Wales, the electoral result would have been quite different.
Okay, we go to Richard here. Oh, okay. We've got to be quick. All right. No, that's okay. Let's go there. That's fine.
I have enjoyed your presentation tonight.
Okay.
One of the things I think, if we put our hat back on our Liberal Party, we find that it's not understood. The product is not understood. So that people who live around Mossman and Manly who vote don't have any idea of what Zali can do and what a lower house member can do.
Okay, so the suggestion the product...
We have to do some education on this.
Okay, the suggestion has got to be brief. The suggestion is the product's not well understood.
Look, I just say, Australia, we've had like the past 2 decades of pretty unparalleled prosperity and security, which means people take things for granted, and a lot of the things that we offer and provide as a Liberal brand, people have been discounting over time as that's just the natural order of things. We could talk about it, and we did. A lot of the election campaign was about the risks of Labor, but if people take these public goods for granted, and increasingly that was the case, then the only way they're not going to take it for granted is if they have them taken away from them or diminished in some way. And, who knows, maybe that's what we'll see over the next 3 to 6 years, and that will help the flock come home, if you like. When people see that you can't take low unemployment for granted, you can't take low interest rates for granted, you can't take inflation under control for granted, all those sorts of things, But that's a hard job.
Yeah, you can't take turning the lights on for granted, or running your dishwasher at 6 o'clock at night.
Yeah, exactly.
Peter Dutton hasn't been mentioned. He has a big weight on his shoulders. How do you think he'll handle it?
I'm incredibly excited that it's Peter running and leading the Liberal Party. He's an incredibly effective leader. One of the things that I've always said about Peter, and I've probably known him 15 or so years, if you ever went to him with an issue or there was something going on, he was incredibly attentive and effective with it. I have a background doing a lot of work around autism, and one of the biggest early learning centres, AEIOU, is based, its headquarters is based in Peter's electorate. And any time we had an issue, NDIS related or otherwise, Peter would always reach out to me directly, unprompted, and help shepherd it through whatever was required within Cabinet. So he has a huge job to do. He's a very good leader. Someone said to me, he's got to work on his, he's unpopular. And it's like, have we ever had a popular Liberal leader? Honestly, I don't think that's our biggest problem. But he is actually a really great guy. And I, have always had a lot of time for Peter and a lot of respect for him. So I think he will do an outstanding job. And I do think as people get to know him, they will like him a lot more, and we'll start to see the humorous side of him, which is actually very entertaining.
Question in here.
Both of you, can you hear me? Both of you have talked about...
There is a...
Okay. both of you have talked about the fact that there needs to be a root and branch investigation of what's happened. A day or so after the election, Peter Credlin wrote a really great article, and she talked about what the Liberal Party is. What do we believe? We believe in freedom, we believe in democracy, we believe in small government, a whole great framework. And one of the things you've talked about, Dave, is actually offering something, and rather than say the Labour Party's no good, what do we offer? And if you took that framework that she put out so clearly and put those things together, you'd have something to go. Yeah?
Yeah. All right, we'll take that as a comment.
Okay, so the couple have got to be very quick.
Her husband's running the review, so I'm sure Peter will have some influence.
You've got to talk into the microphone, okay?
Not the side, the top.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
I told you, it's like family dinner.
Yeah, but if people don't do it, what am I supposed to do? Well, you speak into the microphone, okay?
David Hollie, do you really think that the Liberal Party needs some strong leadership other than people who are actually running in Parliament? The current president of the Liberal Party is my age, and I don't speak the same language as what the voters of today do. Do you think, David, you would like to stand for president of the Liberal Party?
Oh God, I wouldn't wish it on him.
No. But on a more serious note, fish rots from the head down.
You heard it here.
And I tell you, Philip Ruddock is a great guy, but he's my contemporary, and we don't speak the same language.
Okay, we've got it. Right. Okay, are you running?
I wasn't aware there was a vacancy. But I would say, look, my understanding is historically the organs of the Liberal Party and the office bearers within the party had a lot more power and influence over the affairs of the party than the parliamentary wing. And I don't think that has been the case in the last decade or two. And I think if we're to address some of the things that need to be addressing, including all this stuff that happened in the New South Wales division and slow pre-selections, I don't know who was to blame, but I think a stronger organisational structure and party structure would have helped prevent that from happening.
I think it's also fair to say that it's the chief executive rather than the president or chairman who runs these organisations. And when the Liberals were formed after the Second World War, it was John Carrick who ran it. He wasn't the president, he was the general secretary, and a very effective one, but he wasn't the president.
Well, you can't fatten a pig on market day. It's still with us, his expression.
Who runs the party now?
I don't know.
Well, it depends.
That's the problem, isn't it?
It's a federated body, so each state runs itself, and then you've got federal, which sits over the top, which really doesn't have much influence over the day-to-day operations. But as I said to you during the speech, I come from the Bill Heffernan School, my first job in politics. Bill is a former party president and a very successful one when he worked with John Howard coming into government in 1996. There is a legendary story about him putting a pistol on the table at a state executive meeting. It wasn't loaded, I understand. But, you know, between Bill and Mr Howard, they were very, very strong saying, you may have been pre-selected as the candidate, you're not going to win, see you later, and they installed who was. And if you look at the success that they had in a lot of those lower house seats in New South Wales in 96, was because they took very firm action. They weren't worried about upsetting the fields and anyone thinking they didn't get their democratic say or the review wasn't done fast enough. There was very, very strong leadership, and the leadership came from the then Leader of the Opposition and the New South Wales President. I can't even remember who the State Director was at the time. I think no, I can't remember. But, you know, it wasn't Nutty, I can tell you. You know, if Nutty said something, he did that too. But, you know, that was really strong and effective leadership, which made sure we were in an election-winning position. And that's our business, is winning elections. Not making everyone feel good about themselves because they pay a membership fee. Sorry.
So do you favour a revolver on the table? And if you do, would you want it to be loaded or not loaded?
Loaded.
We'll bring the shotgun. We'll have a bit of clay pigeon shooting after. It's a big
Final
team
comment,
building.
Final comment? Where are you off to?
I'm off to Italy on Friday for 4 weeks, and I'll regroup and assess after that. But look, I just say I remain committed to our party, or the Liberal Party, for those of you who are party members here, or those of you who aren't, and as an important force for good within Australia and Australian society. So I may or may not have a future as an elected official, but I will remain committed to serving the party because I believe it's in the best interest of our nation.
Yeah. thanks to Dave Sharma and Hollie Hughes. It's certainly been a lively night. And thanks to all of the people here, and there are many, many more out on Zoom. And of course it goes up on our website, and Sky News is here, so this function will live on. But for tonight, to our speakers, well done. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you so much, Gerard.
And thank you, Hollie.
Thank you, Gerard.